Hello everyone, welcome to your first video lesson. We're going to take a minute and look at a review of integers here over the next about 15 minutes, and during this time you'll get to do a little bit of practice, and we'll really hope to get into an understanding of what integers are. At this point we are going to have a hard time moving forward if you don't have a very solid understanding of what positive and negative numbers are. So to begin with, let's go ahead and start with the definition of an integer. An integer is a number that fits into a number set, and that set of numbers is composed of all the whole numbers and their opposites. So in other words, you have a 3, you have a negative 3, and we include 0 in that list, even though 0 is the only number that does not have an opposite. But again, it's important to remember, integers only mean whole numbers, not fractions and decimals. So on this slide, we're going to try to come up with our rules for adding and subtracting integers, and most of you are familiar with those, but the big idea we're trying to make sure is we have an understanding of where those rules come from. Because oftentimes we remember rules, and when we do that, those don't stick in our head very well because it's just a list of rules. When we understand where the rules come from, that's what's really going to stick in your brain. And I think a lot of the struggles we've had in the past with some of our basic rules of adding and subtracting is we didn't fully understand them. While we were able to do them at the time, we can't retain them because we didn't have a great understanding of why they are what they are. To do that, we're going to try to look at this in two different visual ways. And so the first one's going to be using a number line, and a lot of you were taught that way. And so we'll use our standard number line where 0's in the middle and you have positives on the right and negatives on the left. Our other method we're going to use is we're going to use some plus or minus pictures here. And so these might be unfamiliar to some of you, so I want you to take a minute here. When you look at that plus minus picture at the bottom of the screen here, that number that's on the bottom of the screen is actually the number 3. Because when we look at a plus-minus picture, what we're noticing is a plus and a minus will make 0. A positive and a negative make 0. So these are what we call our 0 pairs. So you have 4 zeros, so they pretty much cancel each other out, and you're left with 3. And we're going to be using those 0 pairs a lot here, so I want us just to have a quick understanding of what those are. So let's look at some examples and see if we can come up with a rule that we understand to do all of our adding and subtracting of integers. So we're going to start with addition, and addition is something that people make a lot of mistakes on because we want to use multiplication rules because multiplication is easier than addition. So we're going to see if we can look at a visual way to help us remember this so that we won't make those mistakes anymore. So just to do a simple example like negative 2 plus 4, we're going to start with very small numbers so that we can visually see how these rules work. And so we're going to go back to a second grade way of thinking. If it worked in second grade, there's no reason to not think that way again. And so when you think about adding simply means moving on the number line. We're saying we're going to start at negative 2, and we're going to move 4 places to the right because we're adding 4. When you add, numbers get larger. That's our second grade way of thinking. So we're going to start at negative 2, and we're going to add 4 until we get to 2. So negative 2 plus 4 is 2. We can visually see that on a number line. That must be true. Let's take that same look at negative 3 plus negative 1. I'm going to do my number line and leave a little room around negative 3. And we're going to start at negative 3. And we're going to add negative 1. To look at this on a number line, we have to think like a second grader again and say, well, I'm adding, so I'm going to go to the right. However, a negative sign, another way to say a negative sign is the opposite. So when we think about that negative, it's actually telling us to go the opposite direction. It's saying add, so go to the right, a negative, so go to the left, 1 space, giving us negative 4. Negative 3 plus negative 1 is negative 4. So there is a second grade way of looking at this. Another way we can look at this is to use what's called a plus-minus diagram. And we showed you earlier what that plus-minus diagram means, where a positive and a negative will cancel out to make 0. So if we want to do these two problems over again, and the first problem was negative 2 plus 4, to make a plus-minus diagram of that is very simple. We have 2 negatives and 4 positives. Well, you have a negative and a positive each making a 0 pair, leaving 2 left over. The pictures are very, very helpful for most of us in the way we learn. It helps these rules make sense. Negative 3 plus negative 1 says you have 3 negatives and you added another one. So now I have 4 negatives. So the answer is negative 4. If you're a person that really struggles with your integers, I strongly suggest drawing a picture. You can always give that a shot and see if that helps. So let's look at what we did and see if we can come up with a rule. Negative 2 plus 4 is 2, and negative 3 plus negative 1 is negative 4. We could draw the pictures, but that's not always realistic. Sometimes the picture, if you're talking about numbers like 37, it gets a little bit ridiculous to draw 37 plus signs. So we need to come up with a rule we can use all the time. And I'm a believer in keeping the rules simple. There's going to be a little bit of vocabulary here, but for the most part, this simple rule is going to be fairly simple. The rule is, when adding integers of the same sign, add the absolute values and keep the sign the same. In other words, we're talking about an example like our second one here, negative 3 plus negative 1. They were both negative. So you simply add the absolute values, in other words, add the digits, 3 and 1, you get 4, keep it negative. And obviously, I'm going to go ahead and assume everyone could do a problem like 5 plus 3 and get 8. So if you're adding 2 positives, your answer is positive. If you're adding 2 negatives, your answer is negative. You simply add them together. Our second example, we had a positive number and a negative number. So our first example, we had a negative 2 plus 4 equals 2. We had a positive number and a negative number. And you notice that's when we're going to create these 0 pairs. A positive and a negative are going to cancel some out. And so you're actually taking away 2 of the 4 positives. So if you're adding integers where the signs are different, what you're really doing is subtracting. So a positive plus a negative, or a negative plus a positive, you simply subtract the absolute values, subtract the digits, and you keep the sign of the larger digit. So therefore, when we look back at our example, 4 is larger than 2. So 4 was positive, our answer was positive. So our addition rules in their simplest of forms are this. If the signs are the same, add them together and keep the sign the same. If the signs are different, subtract and keep the sign of the larger number. So go ahead and take 1 minute and attempt these 3 problems, please. If someone could pause the video, we'll give you a minute to attempt those 3 and see if you understand the rules, and then we'll run through the answers. See you in 1 minute. Alright, so hopefully everyone was able to get to a solution here. And without drawing the pictures, hopefully we can look at a negative and a positive. That tells us we're going to subtract. 8's bigger than 3, so my answer is negative 5. 6 plus negative 5. Positive, negative, so therefore I'm going to subtract. The 6 is larger, so my answer is positive. Negative 7 and negative 4, they're the same, so I'm going to add them together and keep the sign. If it started negative, it stays negative. There's no reason to overcomplicate these rules. All you have to remember, signs the same, add, signs different, subtract. Alright, the rest of this is going to go much more quickly. For subtracting, we really don't have any rules except for one. The only rule we use is subtraction is simply the same as adding the opposite of the second number. What I mean by that is our addition rules say if the signs are different, you subtract. So if there's already subtraction in the addition rules, there's no reason for us to learn subtraction rules. Obviously, we're all aware that 7 minus 4 is going to give 3. Well, what we're saying is, I don't want to do subtraction. I never want to do subtraction. I'm going to add the opposite of the second number. So 7 minus 4, well, that was 7 minus a positive 4. So we change that to 7 plus a negative 4. I know you've been taught this before. I believe the term you may have heard was chop chop in the junior high level. But the reason why that works is, when you look at our rule here, 7 plus negative 4, our rule says they're different, so we subtract, and the larger number gets to keep the sign, so the answer is 3. So therefore, we never have an actual rule for subtracting when we say subtract a negative, subtract a positive. Our rule is simply change the sign from subtraction to addition and change the sign on the second number. If the second number had been negative, it would become positive. If it's positive, it becomes negative. And we have one key thing to remember here. The first number never changes. When we rewrite the problem, you keep the first number the same, change the sign from subtraction to addition, and change the sign on the second number. Let's practice a couple of these. So go ahead and pause the video again for 1 minute and see if you can do these three. Rewrite them first, then come up with a solution. Welcome back. Hopefully everyone was able to do this. When you have negative 4 minus 9, we're not even going to think about a subtraction. We're going to write it as plus a negative. That allows us to now go to our addition rules, which we already have worked on. Negative 4 and negative 9 add to negative 13. So negative 4 minus 9 is negative 13. When I go to rewrite 8 minus negative 3, the minus sign becomes a plus, the negative becomes positive, and I get 8 plus 3 is 11. So 8 minus negative 3 is equal to 11. For number 3, negative 4 minus negative 3, I change the minus to a plus, the 3 becomes positive. Now I go to my addition rules, and that says I have two numbers of different signs. So I subtract and keep the sign of the larger number. Alright, so we're just going to take about a minute and look at multiplication and division. Multiplication and division is much, much easier than adding and subtracting. The rules are very simple, and they seem to make more sense to people. But I do want to just take a second to review why the multiplication and division rules are what they are. Well, the definition of multiplication, if you remember back when you were first taught to multiply, the definition of multiplying was you have groups. For example, if you look down here at 4 times 6, that meant you had 4 groups of 6 apples, or whatever it was your teacher used to present it to you. And so you said, okay, I have 4 6s. And you add those together. That's what multiplication is. By definition, it's repeated addition. So therefore, 4 times 6 says 6 plus 6 plus 6 plus 6, which is 24. Now, hopefully you all know your multiplication facts. When you do the 4 times negative 6, now we're saying you have 4 groups of negative 6. So you have negative 6 and negative 6 and negative 6 and negative 6. That would make negative 24. Now we're going to bring back that other word we said. We said negative also means the opposite. And so when you read negative 4 times 6, what that says is the opposite of 4 times 6. So you have the opposite of 4 groups of 6. So that's going to be Our 4 groups of 6, the opposite, so negative 24. Negative 4 times negative 6 is the opposite of 4 groups of negative 6. So we have 4 groups of negative 6 up there. We change the sign, it's 24. So that's the why it works. The rules we all remember are very simple. If the signs are the same, your answer is positive. If the signs are different, your answer is negative. So a positive times a positive is positive. A negative times a negative is positive. If the signs are different, positive times negative and negative times positive, your answer is going to be negative. So that's a very, very simple rule. And we're going to skip doing the examples of that, the practice, because I think you can all do that. You can go ahead and get started on your homework. Remember, there are no calculators allowed. This is your basic facts. You need to be able to do this without a calculator. Good luck.